Welcome to Diverse Learning Practices Ed Talk podcast, where we are meeting the needs of all learners. I'm your host, Devine. Hello, teachers, educators, and administrators. I am Celeta Devine, and I'm here today with our second episode of Diverse Learning Practices Education podcast. And so this particular episode is very special to me because we're going to unpack what the meaning of diverse learning practices really is. And so I'm going to reflect tonight on a few questions that I typically get as people are inquiring more about diverse learning practices and who we are and how we operate. One of the questions that I often get is just what does diverse learning practices even mean? And so when I think about diverse learning practices, I think about diversity in the realm of instructional practices. One of the common things that a lot of people think about at first when we think about diversity, we think about cultural backgrounds, ethnicity, and things of that nature. And although those things are important, diverse learning practices is positioned to help educators understand that we must be diverse in the strategies, in the learning practices, in the material, and all of the other things that we use to actually teach students. And so diversity is scaffolding, differentiated instructions, and responding to the different types of learners that you will have in your classroom. And so that's what diverse learning practices means to me. It is a diverse toolbox of strategies that you will use based on the students who are sitting in your room, and also for administrators based on the teachers that are in your building. So, another question that I get sometimes is where does the initials diverse learning practices, DLP, come into play? So, sometimes you will hear us refer to ourselves as diverse learning practices, and sometimes you may hear us refer to ourselves as DLP education. And DLP were the initials of my younger sister, and her name was Deidre Louise Pruitt. And so when I was thinking about a company and an educational company, she came to mind. And I knew whatever I titled it, I wanted it to fit something that told the story of her educational experience, as well as gave honor to her as well, because she's no longer with us. And the reason I chose to name my company after Deidre Louise Pruitt, DLP, Diverse Learning Practices, is because of the story that she had in high school. When she was in high school, she was to graduate right around the time of the No Child Left Behind. So when I graduated from high school, we did not have an exit test. I missed that barely, but I missed it. But she caught it. And my sister, she was diagnosed with ADHD. She was diagnosed with ADD and a couple more things. She was the sweetest soul. She was such a beautiful person. And I actually personally, I don't think I feel this way just because she's my sister. I personally feel like she was an angel on earth. But during that No Child Left Behind, it was high accountability and consequences for teachers and students. But when it first came about, there were not the things that are in place for us today, like inclusion classrooms, training for teachers on differentiated instruction. So she had to pay the penalty of the consequence of the No Child Left Behind Act without receiving proper modifications for her learning styles. And she was being taught by teachers, although they were good teachers, who had not at the time been trained or fully understood what it took to differentiate instruction for different types of learners. And so she began to take that state exam, and it was the English test that she had the most trouble with. and she could not pass that exam. And it got right there to the last time that she could take it, and our family and community, we were praying that she was going to pass that test and be able to get her diploma. But she did not. She did not pass. And her being her, she still walked around with her chest out and a smile on her face. And the other thing that happened for her is they offered the test in the summer. And then they offered the test, although she was done with her qualifications for high school. She was an A, B, sometimes C student. So she had completed all of those requirements. And so she didn't pass the test, as I said. And so when they offered the test in the summer, guess who was there? Deidre Louise Pruitt. When they offered the test, even though she was postgraduate time, back in the winter, guess who was there? Deidre Louise Pruitt. And then in the spring, guess who came back to take their test? She's in the workforce, and she was in the workforce at that point. Guess who came back to take that test? Deidre Louise Pruitt. And she did that for several years, all the way up until she was about 20. And the people at the school they admired her so much, as did I, her determination, her attitude, because most people at that point, post-graduation time, I didn't pass the test, they're not going to keep coming back to their high school to take that test in a class of other high school students that may have known her. They're just not going to do that. But she did, because she was determined. And we were super proud of her, and we would always cheer her on, and we would always pray for her. But it just didn't work out. And unfortunately, my sister passed right before her 21st birthday. She passed. And I can remember specifically at the funeral, and so many of her former teachers and the administrators, they came during our family hour. And they did one of the most beautiful gestures that I have ever witnessed in life. And that particular thing was they gave my mother and father her high school diploma. And it brought so many tears to our eyes, because they knew, and we knew, that she never gave up on trying to get that high school diploma, despite her learning deficiencies, and despite the fact that they were not adequately met, because at that time, teachers were not prepared for that type of instruction. And so when I think about diverse learning practices, I think about Deidre Louise Pruitt, and it makes me feel and understand the necessity of teachers understanding how to diversify instruction. There are students whose lives literally depend on it. And so that is why we came up with the name Diverse Learning Practices, DLP. So I'm going to move on. One of the other questions that I think that I have to respond to sometimes is there is an assumption that when we think about diversity or differentiation, etc., a lot of times people initially think remediation. And even in the case of my sister, that was something that she needed. She needed some remediation. But when I'm thinking about diverse learning practices, it is about a teacher having the skill set and the school system having the skill set to scaffold down instruction for those students who need it. But it is not limited to that. It is also the teacher's ability to increase the rigor and not lowering it. It's not just about interventions. It's about high quality instruction for all learners. And so our slogan for diverse learning practices is meeting the needs of all learners. And so that's students that need remediation, but that is also that also includes students who can be taught on a collegiate level, that are ready for enrichment. And so, as an educator, we need to be prepared for that. As a principal, you need to make sure that your teachers are equipped for that. As a school district, the same thing. We have to have those things in place because we have to meet students where they are. Now, that was the story of my sister who did need some remediation, but my personal children were gifted children. And call me Mama Bear, I was not going to be happy if they were sitting in a class where they were doing mediocre work because they could do so much more. And it also brings me to another short story. As an instructional coach, there was a time when we had someone who came into our building and they had this initiative, and it was a writing strategy, and it was a super simplified writing strategy. And so many of the students at the school that I was at were having trouble with writing. And so they just said, hey, everybody at the school, we're going to do this writing strategy and we're going to increase those scores. Every single teacher, every single student, we're going to do those writing. We're going to do this writing strategy, and that's it. And I said, now I do understand that there is a deficiency at our school, but you're not going to make me believe that every single student at this pretty large high school needed a remediated writing strategy. They did not. And we would be doing a disservice to the students if we had done that. That's why it's so important to understand diversity in instructional practices. Rigor is super important to me because it helps to build better thinkers. And especially during this day and age of AI and all of the things that are coming along, we've already had trouble with students not thinking as deeply as they should. And so rigor is important. And that's what rigor is. It is creating a process and instructional spaces for students to think deeply, to be engaged in standards, to enhance their critical thinking for life preparation. And one of the other questions is, what does it actually look like in education? So there's a phrase that I like to say, by any means necessary. Another thing I say is, whatever it takes. And people sometimes they'll ask me, what does that look like? What do you mean when you say whatever it takes? And so it really boils down to getting to know who your students are. And there are a plethora of things that you have to consider: background, culture, their test scores, of course, where they are. And so whatever it takes means if I have to incorporate music in my instruction, or movement, or small group instruction, or intervention, or enrichment, or scaffolding, or relationship building, or modeling, or creativity, or project based learning, or differentiated instruction, by any means necessary, I am determined to give students what they need. Another question has been, as diverse learning practices has grown, people ask me, what do I really hope that teachers and school leaders take away from our work, the work that we do? We're all about empowering teachers and educators so that they can in turn empower the students that they teach, and we can empower our communities and our school systems. And so we're a firm believer in pedagogy that is very practical, hands-on strategies that you can use today. But I do believe personally, it's not just about being able to give a teacher a particular practical strategy that's going to help them to see results, but it's also about helping the teacher be able to curate and create their own learning instructional practices based on what the research says, but also who they are and who their students are. And so we don't want to just give teachers resources, but we want to really help to build that capacity so that they can become the best version of themselves. Because as we talk about students not necessarily always thinking as critically as we want to, if we're not careful in education, we will take away the teacher's identity as a creator and as a critical thinker and as a lesson designer. So a lot of our work is we understand what our goal is, differentiation, and we all have been given a set of standards and criteria that we must follow. But it is up to us to stand side by side with that teacher and help them to develop and think critically and plan and design lessons that can be both in a remediated fashion and also those that are super rigorous. And if I could leave one message about teaching and learning, what would it be? That's the last question that I get. And I would say that teachers need to be willing to do whatever they need to do in order for their students to grow. If I need to sing, I'll sing. If I need to bring in some collegiate level text, then that's what I'm going to do. If I need to bring in a special speaker, that's what I'm going to do. If I need to bring in an expert on inclusion practices, that's what I'm going to do. So teachers need to be willing to do that. Administrators need to be willing to do that. Superintendents need to be willing to do that. Parents need to be willing to do that. And students also need to be willing to do whatever it takes to maximize their own learning. And so diverse learning practices, DLP, Deidre Louise Pruitt, we are on a mission to ensure that we truly are meeting the needs of every single learner. Thank you for tuning in to Diverse Learning Practices Ed Talk podcast. Don't forget to follow and share. Until next time, keep teaching, keep growing, and keep making a difference.